It's been, well, very nearly 50 years since I had what was at that point the most difficult struggle in my life to make whatever decision I was going to make. It was my senior year, I guess it has been 50 years now. It was my senior year in high school. And the choice before me was, do I go to Bible college where my dad and my sister had gone, and where from the time I was a little kid, I I figured I would go because I thought, well, I'm going to be a preacher like my daddy. Or would I go to Oklahoma State University where my friends and my girlfriend were going, and where I had a real peachy scholarship offered to me? I didn't know. I mean, at that point in my life, I struggled to decide what was God's will for me on that whole thing. I fasted, and I'm not a good faster, but I fasted. I took my Bible to school with me. I hid out under a stairwell and read scripture and prayed and tried to think during lunchtime when all the my buds were out having lunch, and I got nothing. I it, all I wanted was God's will. I think most Christians at some point are going to have that kind of dilemma. And well, obviously not going to be about the same issue, but all of us come to a place where we want to know, what is God's will? What should I do next? What does God want me to do? What does he intend me to do next with my life? God's will is, it's paramount. I want to be living by his design, by his will, by his desires. I want my life to fit with his plan. And my goodness, I don't have I'm not smart enough. I'm not intuitive enough. Honestly, I'm not spiritual enough to be able to, pick that out of the air. It was very frustrating, and at times it has been frustrating to me now, these many years later. And through those many years, I have had a number of similar kinds of dilemmas about what is God's will. One of the difficulties that I think many people have, especially in the West, especially where the church is not under any form of persecution, where we are rarely even inconvenienced because of our faith, we have this idea that God's will always make me happy. God's will, now here's how we got there. God's will is always for my best. But we have to realize that many things that are for our best will not make us happy. They seem difficult at the time. The writer of Hebrews says, no discipline seems pleasant at the time. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace. Well, see, God's will, for me to live within God's will, I have to experience his discipline. Now, that's not the same thing as his punishment. His discipline is a process of teaching me to choose wisely, to choose the best, to seek his design and fit in within it. But that won't always be a happy experience. There are times when it will not be happy. And Peter cites one of those times. We're in 1 Peter chapter 3, and we just looked at verses 15 and 16, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. Wait, now hold on. That won't fit with my worldview. That doesn't connect correctly with my sense of what would God's will be. For it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. Okay, now, there's just one level that I get that instantly. Doing good is better than doing evil. And God's will is for me to do good, not evil. That's easy, right? But that I should suffer for doing good? Well, that won't compute. That just doesn't fit with my view of life. If I do good, life should be fair enough that I will get good. Now, here's an interesting thing. Often, very often, when I do good, I get good. We live in a world of cause and effect. The Apostle Paul said we reap what we sow. It's been called the law of the harvest. You get what you put in, and you get back what you put in. And if you sow good, you generally get good back. But now listen, there are times, this is going to break with most of American Christianity. There are times when it isn't just that, wow, that fell outside what usually happens, that you didn't get good for doing good. What an accident. That's too bad. Well, it probably is too bad, and yet it is possible that it is God's will that I will suffer for doing good. Why would God do that? Well, first of all, since you and I are neither one God, we can't categorically explain why he would do anything, okay? But from history, our past experience, what we know of God's nature, what he's revealed of himself, we know that he is a perfect Father. Now, there are a few things that means. A perfect Father never makes mistakes about how he raises his kids. Oh, I wish I was a perfect father. I made so many mistakes about how I parented my daughters. It's just God's grace that he put me with a fabulous woman for my wife, who turned out to be, I only half jokingly say, she makes the Proverbs 31 woman look like a minor leaguer. A ball, not even AAA. She's amazing, so godly and so thoughtful, and I run out of adjectives, and yet she's not perfect either. We didn't have to pay what we probably should have for all the mistakes that we made in raising our kids. It was God's grace that moved past the mistakes that we made. There are no perfect parents. I guess what I should have just said that and left it. But here's the deal. God is a perfect parent. He never makes a mistake. And when his will calls for something in my life or your life, it's because that's exactly what we needed. That was a perfect call to nurture or create or build in us the character and nature, the spirit that he intends for us to have. Now, God's will is a very big subject. And I want to take a little trip into the idea today of God's will. One of the most helpful things I ever came across was way back. This was in the 80s when we had cassette tape players in our car, right? Remember that? And I got this tape recording of a conference. I don't remember the presenter. I have no idea what conference it was from, but I got the tape from somebody, and the topic was God's will. And the presenter said, I give lots of these presentations about God's will, and I could summarize it here with this question. If you knew exactly what God's will was, would you do it? That's a tough question to answer. Of course, you want to say, well, sure, I would. But here's realistically, it's easy for me to do things I want to do, things that make me happy, things that make me feel good. Well, yeah, if God's will is about that, no question, I'll do it. What about if it's hard? It's a little less of a definite yes. What about if it is absolutely painful to do? Or I get punished for doing it? Then you see the gap narrows, or widens actually. The gap between what I feel like I would do and what might actually happen. Well, what I'm saying is God's will is not bound by my desires. See, God doesn't determine his will on the basis of my desires. He determines his will on the basis of what he knows, because he knows everything. The word for that, theologically, is he is omniscient. There's nothing he doesn't know. That's big. There's nothing in the future that he doesn't already know. There's nothing in my present that he doesn't already know, and makes sense then that there's nothing in the past that he doesn't know. There's nothing outside his purveyance and his knowledge. He structures his will according to what he knows is, I'll even say, perfect. The Apostle Paul in Romans 12 says in 12:1, don't be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and then you will know God's will, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. His will is perfect. It doesn't seem perfect sometimes, but it is perfect. Now, there's a few things I want to ask you to bear in mind about God's will. First thing is God's will, because it's perfect, never omits any particular piece of information that sets the context. And what that basically means is he is never unaware of certain outcomes that we fear. He is okay with that. Or else, if his will is perfect, then what he chooses for us to do is the absolutely right thing to do. Now, a second thing about God's will is that it can be very individual and very specific, but it is also a universal thing. And there's a side of God and his omniscience that he is able, his will is so broad and large and so sovereign that my not choosing his will not keep his ultimate will from happening. This is what makes God's will so hard. An aspect of God's will is that he gave us free will. In other words, his will is for us to have freedom to choose. We can either choose his will for ourselves or not. We can choose his will, or we can choose another person's, our own. Okay, the waters get muddy. Now there are things, two other things that you have to bear in mind about God's will. And my time's running out. I mean, I'm going to go over, so sorry. But here's two other things you got to remember. Number one, there is God's permitted will, what He permits. I believe that everything in life passes through the grid of God's knowledge, His awareness. He cannot be unaware of something that will happen. In other words, it's impossible for God to look down on it and go, whoa, how did that happen? He already knows. So everything that happens in my life goes through the grid of His permission. Okay? So there's the permissive will of God, and then there is the active will of God. The active will of God is things that He causes to happen to bring circumstances to bear in a person's life. Both of those, they're okay. And those two things come into play very importantly here in this concept of if it is God's will that you should suffer for doing good. So if I suffer for doing good, either God has permitted this to happen or He has been in the causative side. For me, most often in reflection, I think He's been permissive, because what I think He's permitting that kind of thing to do is He is permitting it to happen so that it will shape my character. When He gives a test, and I think that's often what this is, it's so that we can pass it. He already knows what we know and what we don't know, but we don't know what we know and don't know. That's part of the reason that He permits these kinds of things to happen. His permissive will permits it to happen that I would suffer for doing good. Can you tell? There is nobody that can really explain this whole will of God thing in a way that everything about it makes sense. Not going to. I'm sure not going to, and I think I just proved it. And by the way, I spent 17 minutes and 45 seconds proving that I can't go there. I beg your grace. And I hope that you'll join me again next time for Soul Care with Stevie Boy.